The night air carried a chill that seeped through the thin walls of the car, though James Carter barely noticed. His mind was focused on the small bag of medicine sitting on the passenger seat beside him. The medicine was for his 5-year-old daughter, Amara, a bundle of light and joy in a life otherwise weighed down by hardship. It was late, and Amara was already dozing off in the back seat, her tiny body swaddled in a blanket. The hum of the engine seemed to lull her into a peaceful sleep, her face relaxed, untouched by the burdens her father carried every day. James was a man who had once stood tall and proud, a veteran of the military with dreams of building a better life for his family, but life after service had been cruel. The promises of a stable career, respect, and opportunity had crumbled under the weight of systemic racism and societal indifference. Jobs were scarce, and those he managed to land offered little more than insultingly low wages. Now, he worked as a night security guard at a rundown warehouse, barely making enough to scrape by. Every day felt like a battle, but not the kind he had been trained to fight. As he drove through the dimly lit streets of their neighborhood, the weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the muscles in his arms taut with tension. But then, his eyes caught sight of the grocery store ahead, and a flicker of relief crossed his face. He remembered Amara's favorite cereal was on sale, something she rarely got to enjoy. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Moments of joy were scarce these days, and he was desperate to give her even the smallest slice of happiness. The parking lot was nearly full, with no spaces left. James hesitated. He glanced back at Amara, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with her breaths. It would only take a minute, he thought. The store was practically empty, and the cereal was right near the front. He pulled up along the curb, leaving the car idling as he quickly exited. The night was quiet except for the faint buzz of a street lamp overhead. He hurried into the store, his boots clicking against the cold pavement. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the empty aisles. James made a beeline for the cereal shelf, relieved to see the last box of Amara's favorite still there. He grabbed it and turned on his heel, heading straight for the cashier. Less than 2 minutes had passed. As he stepped back outside, cereal in hand, he froze. A police car had pulled up behind his vehicle, its lights flashing in aggressive bursts of red and blue. A uniformed officer stood beside it, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. James's heart sank. He knew this wouldn't end well. "Is this your car?" the officer asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. He was a tall man, his face obscured by the harsh shadows cast by the street lamp. The badge on his chest gleamed in the artificial light. "Yes, sir," James replied evenly, keeping his hands visible. He had learned long ago that any sudden movements could be misinterpreted. "You can't park here," the officer snapped, his voice carrying an edge of hostility. "This is a fire lane." "I understand," James said calmly, though his stomach churned with unease. "I was just picking up something for my daughter. She's in the car." The officer's gaze shifted toward the vehicle, where Amara's small form was barely visible in the back seat. His expression hardened. "Leaving a child unattended in a car is a crime, you know." "She's asleep," James explained, his voice steady but firm. "I was only gone for a minute." The officer took a step closer, his stance aggressive. "People like you always think the rules don't apply to them." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. Years of experience had taught him that responding to such provocations only made things worse. He forced himself to remain calm, even as anger bubbled beneath the surface. "License and registration," the officer demanded. James complied, moving slowly and deliberately as he retrieved the requested documents from his wallet and glove compartment. He handed them over, watching as the officer scrutinized them with a disdainful smirk. "Stay here," the officer barked, retreating to his patrol car to run James's information. The minutes stretched into an eternity as James stood by his vehicle, the cold night air biting at his skin. Amara stirred in the back seat, her small voice calling out sleepily for her father. "It's okay, sweetheart," James said softly, turning to look at her through the window. "Everything's going to be fine." But he wasn't so sure. When the officer returned, his demeanor was even more confrontational. "You're getting a ticket," he announced, pulling out his notepad. "Parking in a fire lane and endangering a child. That'll be $500. James's stomach dropped. $500 was more than half his monthly rent. There was no way he could afford it. "Sir," he began, keeping his tone respectful, "I can't pay that. Is there any way—" "Don't argue with me," the officer interrupted, his voice rising. "If you can't pay, maybe you should think about making better choices." Amara's soft cries from the back seat grew louder, her small face pressed against the window. "Daddy, what's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The officer glanced at her, his expression cold and unyielding. "Get back in the car and leave, now." James took the ticket without another word, his hands shaken with frustration and humiliation. As he climbed back into the driver's seat, he avoided meeting the eyes of the neighbors who had gathered at their windows to watch the scene unfold. Their faces were blank, offering neither judgment nor support, just apathy. As he drove away, the weight of the ticket felt crushing, but even heavier was the look of fear and confusion on Amara's face. She was too young to understand the complexities of systemic injustice, but she could sense the unfairness of what had just happened. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. James swallowed hard, forcing a reassuring smile. "No, baby, we're not in trouble. Everything's going to be okay." But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it. The drive home felt longer than usual, the oppressive silence in the car broken only by the faint hum of the engine and Amara's occasional sniffles. James kept his eyes on the road, though his thoughts wandered. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white with tension. The crisp ticket sat on the dashboard, an unwelcome reminder of the night's events. Each glance at it felt like another blow, a sharp jab to his already fragile sense of stability. Amara had drifted back to sleep, her small head leaning against the window, her blanket clutched tightly in her hand. James glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his chest tightening. She was too young to understand, but he knew the impact of this moment would linger in ways she might not even recognize. The fear she had felt, the tears she had shed, those were burdens she shouldn't have to bear. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest home, James cut the engine and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the darkened windows of the house. The structure, though weathered and in need of repairs, was the only place they could call their own. It was a far cry from the home he had once envisioned for his family, but it was all they had. James exhaled deeply, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Carefully, he exited the car and moved to the back seat, lifting Amara into his arms. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake, her head resting against his shoulder. Her warmth was a small comfort, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Inside, the house was cold, the heating system barely functional in the chilly night. James laid Amara down on her small bed, tucking her in with gentle hands. He brushed a stray curl from her face, lingering for a moment to watch her sleep. Her soft, even breaths were a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. In the quiet of the house, the events of the night replayed in his mind. The officer's condescending tone, the neighbor's apathetic gazes, the ticket that now felt like a death sentence. Each memory stoked the embers of frustration and anger that smoldered in his chest. This wasn't the life he had fought for. This wasn't the future he had promised his wife. He moved to the kitchen, where the flickering overhead light cast a dim glow. The counters were cluttered with bills, past due notice, medical expenses, utilities, and the sight of them only deepened his despair. The ticket seemed to mock him from its place on the table, a stark reminder of his powerlessness. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, and let out a shaky breath. The memories came unbidden, sharp and unrelenting. He saw his wife, her smile radiant as she painted on their small porch. Her laughter had been his refuge, her optimism a guiding light even in the darkest times. Losing her had been a blow he never fully recovered from. The accident had taken more than her life. It had stolen his anchor, his partner, his hope. And the injustice of it all, that the other driver, a man with connections and privilege, had walked away unscathed, was a wound that refused to heal. James clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had tried to move on for Amara's sake, to be the father she deserved, but the weight of grief and injustice often felt insurmountable. Tonight had been a stark reminder of the world they lived in, a world that seemed determined to crush them at every turn. As the hours crept by, the cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't move. His mind was a whirlwind of memories and fears, his body heavy with exhaustion. When the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, he finally rose, his movements sluggish. He couldn't afford the luxury of despair. Amara needed him. The next day unfolded like so many others, grinding monotony punctuated by moments of quiet joy with Amara. Her laughter as she colored at the kitchen table, her questions about the world around her, her boundless curiosity. All of it reminded James of what he was fighting for, but the ticket loomed in the back of his mind, a constant source of stress. Days later, the mail brought a new blow, a court summons. James stared at the envelope, and his heart sinking. He knew what this meant. The ticket was no longer just a financial burden. It was a legal battle he couldn't afford to lose. The thought of standing before a judge, of trying to explain himself to a system that had already written him off, filled him with dread. That night, as Amara slept, James sat at the kitchen table, the summons spread out before him. The words blurred together as he stared at the paper, his mind racing. He thought of the countless times he had been denied jobs, the judgmental stares, the whispered slurs. He thought of his wife, of the accident, of the justice that had been denied. And he thought of Amara, of the life he wanted to give her, of the future she deserved. Something shifted within him then, a quiet resolve taken root. He couldn't let this be the end. He couldn't let the system dictate their lives. For Amara's sake, he had to fight. It wasn't just about the ticket or the court case. It was about standing up against the injustices that had plagued him for so long. James didn't know where to begin or how to navigate the complexities of the legal system, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He thought of the few friends he still had, people who might be willing to help. He thought of community organizations, of anyone who might be able to provide guidance. He would have to swallow his pride and ask for help, something that didn't come easily to him. As the night wore on, James began to formulate a plan. It was vague and uncertain, but it was a start. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. He glanced toward Amara's room, where the faint glow of her night light spilled into the hallway. Her drawings were taped to the walls, colorful depictions of a world filled with wonder and possibility. They were a stark contrast to the reality they faced, but they served as a reminder of what he was fighting for. James rose from the table, his resolve solidifying with each step. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the pain and loss, but he could fight for a better future. For Amara, for himself, for the promise of a life where they wouldn't have to live in fear and struggle. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and uncertainties, but James was determined to face it head-on. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a spark of defiance against the forces that sought to keep him down. And as he climbed into bed that night, exhausted but resolute, he whispered a silent promise to his sleeping daughter. He wouldn't let the world break them. The courtroom loomed large in James's mind long before he stepped foot inside. The letter summoning him to appear was worn at the edges from the number of times he had unfolded and refolded it, rereading the stark black print as if hoping the words might change. But they never did. His court date was set, and the countdown to Judgment Day began with a weighty inevitability. The morning of the hearing arrived too soon. James woke early, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a pale light through the thin curtains of his bedroom. The air in the house was thick with an unspoken tension. Amara sat at the kitchen table, her tiny hands gripping a crayon as she worked on one of her drawings. Her innocence was a cruel contrast to the storm brewing in James's chest. She looked up at him and smiled, a simple, radiant expression that nearly undid him. "You'll do great, Daddy," she said, her voice filled with unshakable confidence. James forced a smile, kneeling beside her to brush a kiss against her forehead. "Thanks, sweetheart." He had arranged for a neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, to watch Amara for the day. A kind but reserved woman, Mrs. Holloway had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had taken a liking to Amara's sunny demeanor. As James prepared to leave, Amara hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "Promise you'll come back soon?" she whispered. "I promise," James replied, though his voice wavered. The courthouse was a monolithic building of gray stone and glass, its architecture cold and imposing. As James approached, the sheer scale of it seemed to magnify his anxiety. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old paper and floor polish. People milled about, lawyers in crisp suits, clerks clutching stacks of files, defendants wearing expressions ranging from defiance to despair. James checked in with the clerk at the front desk, then took a seat on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom. He clutched the envelope containing his documents, proof of his financial struggles, medical bills for Amara, a letter from his employer, anything that might help his case. His palms were damp, and he wiped them on his pants, forcing himself to take slow, steady breaths. At precisely 9 a.m., the courtroom doors swung open and the clerk called his name. James rose, his legs feeling like lead as he walked inside. The room was smaller than he had imagined, but it felt no less intimidating. Rows of wooden benches faced the bench where the judge presided, flanked by the prosecutor's table and the defendant's table. The walls were lined with shelves of legal books, their spines bearing titles James couldn't begin to comprehend. Judge Hayes sat at the elevated bench, his expression stern and inscrutable. He was a man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed back and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through whoever stood before him. His black robe hung loosely over his broad shoulders, and his gavel rested on the desk before him, a symbol of authority that needed no explanation. James had heard of Judge Hayes before. He was known for his unyielding adherence to the law, a man who valued order above all else. Rumors painted him as both a fair and a fearsome figure, a judge who didn't tolerate excuses. As James stood before him, he couldn't help but feel like he was already guilty in the judge's eyes. The prosecutor wasted no time, launching into a description of the events that led to James's summons. Her tone was sharp and clinical as she outlined the charges: illegal parking in a fire lane, leaving a child unattended in a vehicle, and endangering public safety. Each word felt like a hammer blow, and James struggled to keep his composure. When it was his turn to speak, James rose slowly, clutching the edge of the table for support. His voice was steady but quiet as he recounted the events of that night. He explained the urgency of getting medicine for his daughter, the lack of parking, the briefness of his absence. He spoke of his financial struggles, his low-paying job, and his desperate attempt to provide for Amara. He didn't plead for pity, but he hoped for understanding. Judge Hayes listened without interrupting, his face an unreadable mask. When James finished, the room fell silent. The prosecutor's gaze was sharp, her posture confident, as if she was certain the judge would side with her. Then, from the back of the room, a small voice broke the silence. Daddy didn't do anything wrong. All heads turned as Amara stepped forward, her small frame dwarfed by the courtroom. Mrs. Holloway had brought her, and she stood just behind the child, her expression apologetic but firm. "Amara," James whispered, his heart sinking, "you're not supposed to be here." But Amara ignored him. She walked to the front of the room, clutching one of her drawings in her hand. She held it up for the judge to see, a colorful depiction of their family, with James holding her hand and her mother smiling down from a cloud. "Mama said Daddy always does his best," Amara said, her voice trembling but determined. "She's in the sky now, but she watches us. She knows Daddy is a good person." The courtroom fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Judge Hayes's stern expression softened imperceptibly, a flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossing his face. He leaned forward slightly, studying the child before him. "What's your name, young lady?" he asked, his voice gentler than before. "Amara Carter," she replied. "I'm 5 years old." Judge Hayes nodded, his gaze lingering on the drawing she held. He seemed to be lost in thought, his stern exterior cracking just enough to reveal a glimpse of humanity beneath. The prosecutor began to object, but Judge Hayes raised a hand to silence her. "That's enough," he said firmly. He turned his attention back to James. "Mr. Carter, it's clear that you've faced significant challenges. While the law is the law, it must also be tempered with understanding." James's breath caught in his throat as the judge continued. "I will take your circumstances into consideration. However, I must deliberate further before making my decision. Court is adjourned until tomorrow." The gavel struck the bench with finality, and the room began to empty. James knelt beside Amara, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly, though his voice was filled with gratitude. "But thank you." Amara smiled, her small hand clutching his. "Mama said you'd be okay." As they left the courthouse, James felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer a solitary battle. And as he held Amara's hand, He felt the weight of her unwavering faith in him, a strength that would carry him through whatever came next. The courtroom buzzed with subdued murmurs as the spectators shuffled out, their voices blending into a low hum that filled the emptying space. James remained seated at the defendant's table, his hands gripping the edges as if to anchor himself. Amara's words still echoed in his mind, her innocent plea a stark contrast to the cold, procedural atmosphere of the courtroom. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a flicker of hope, not a blazing fire, but a fragile ember threatening to be snuffed out at any moment. As the bailiff approached to escort him out, James glanced toward Judge Hayes. The stern man was still seated at his elevated bench, rifling through papers with a contemplative expression. There was something different in his demeanor, a subtle shift that James couldn't quite place. It was as if Amara's presence had left a mark, a crack in the impenetrable armor of authority the judge wore so tightly. Outside the courthouse, James knelt beside Amara, pulling her into a protective hug. She looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes, her small hand clutching the drawing she had presented to the judge. "Amara, you shouldn't have come," he said, his voice a mix of reprimand and gratitude. "This isn't a place for kids." "But Mama said we're a team," she replied matter-of-factly, her childlike logic piercing through his defenses. "And teams stick together." James exhaled, his heart swelling with a bittersweet mixture of love and frustration. "We are a team," he conceded, brushing a stray curl from her face. "But next time, let me handle it, okay?" She nodded solemnly, though James could see the glimmer of pride in her eyes. Mrs. Holloway hovered nearby, her expression both apologetic and resolute. "I'm sorry, James," she said, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "She was so insistent, and I thought, well, maybe it was for the best." James wanted to argue, to point out the potential consequences of Amara's actions, but the words died on his lips. Deep down, he knew Mrs. Holloway meant well, and he couldn't deny the impact Amara's presence had made. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice low, "for bringing her, for everything." Mrs. Holloway nodded, patting Amara gently on the shoulder. "You've got a special one here," she said with a small smile. "Don't let the world take that away from her." James watched as she walked away, her figure retreating into the crowd. He tightened his grip on Amara's hand, the weight of her trust settling heavily on his shoulders. He had to protect her, to fight for her, no matter how insurmountable the odds seemed. The next day arrived with an oppressive sense of anticipation. James dressed carefully, choosing the only suit he owned, a relic from his wedding, its fabric worn but still serviceable. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. Tired eyes, lines etched deep into his face, a man worn down by life but still standing. He straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to meet his own gaze. "You can do this," he murmured, though the words felt hollow. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, her legs swinging idly as she watched him. "You look like a superhero, Daddy," she said with a grin. James chuckled, the sound strained but genuine. "Superheroes don't wear ties, kiddo." "Maybe you're a new kind of superhero," she countered, her voice filled with conviction. "The kind that fights with words." James didn't respond, but her words lingered as they made their way back to the courthouse. The atmosphere inside was markedly different from the day before. The spectators were fewer, their conversations subdued, as if the weight of the previous day's events had left an indelible mark. James took his place at the defendant's table, his hands resting on the smooth wood as he waited for the judge to enter. When Judge Hayes finally appeared, the room fell silent. He took his seat at the bench, his expression unreadable. The gavel struck once, a sharp sound that echoed through the chamber. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, his tone measured. "After careful consideration of the circumstances surrounding your case, I have reached a decision. However, before I proceed, I would like to hear from you one final time." James swallowed hard, rising to his feet. His palms were sweaty, but he clenched them into fists, grounding himself. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting the judge's. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I know I made a mistake. Parking in that fire lane was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But I wasn't trying to break the law. I was trying to do what any parent would do: take care of my child." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I've served my country, worked hard, and tried to be a good father. But the world, it doesn't make it easy. Every day feels like a battle just to survive, to give my daughter the life she deserves. I'm not asking for pity, Your Honor. I'm asking for understanding, for a chance to do better." The room was silent, all eyes on Judge Hayes as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. His gaze was piercing, but there was a flicker of something else. Empathy, perhaps? "I reviewed your case thoroughly," the judge said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "The law exists to maintain order, to ensure fairness and safety. But the law is not infallible, nor is it immune to context. In your situation, Mr. Carter, I see not a criminal, but a man trying to navigate a system that often fails those who need it most." James's breath caught as the judge continued. "Therefore, I am waiving the fine associated with your ticket. Instead, I am mandating that you attend a community support program designed to provide resources for families in need. Additionally, I recommend you reach out to legal aid organizations that may assist you in securing a better future for yourself and your daughter." The gavel struck again, signaling the end of the proceedings. The weight that had pressed down on James for weeks lifted slightly, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. He turned to Amara, who beamed up at him, her eyes shining with pride. "See, Daddy?" she whispered. "You're a superhero." As they left the courthouse, James felt the first stirrings of hope, a fragile, tentative thing, but real nonetheless. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time he believed it was a road worth traveling. And as Amara slipped her small hand into his, he knew he wouldn't be walking it alone. The courthouse lobby was quieter than James had expected as he walked out, holding Amara's hand tightly in his own. Outside, the city hummed with life. Cars rushed past, people moved purposefully down the sidewalks, and the faint wail of a distant siren echoed through the streets. But for James, the noise seemed muted, like the world had taken a step back to let him catch his breath. The decision, handed down by Judge Hayes, felt like a small victory, but James knew the battle was far from over. The community program was a lifeline, an opportunity to gather resources and connect with people who might help him carve out a better future. Yet, there was an underlying current of uncertainty, a question he couldn't shake. Why had Judge Hayes shown leniency? What had made a man so reputedly strict bend, even slightly, in his favor? Amara skipped along beside him, her mood as light as the sun shining overhead. "Did we win, Daddy?" she asked, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. James hesitated, considering her question. "I think we got a second chance," he replied finally, "and that's pretty close to a win." Her smile widened, and she tightened her grip on his hand. "Mama would be proud of you." she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of certainty only a child could have. James felt his throat tighten, but he managed a nod. I hope so, sweetheart. I really do. Back at home, the world settled into its usual rhythm, though James couldn't shake the events of the past few days. He found himself replaying the courtroom scene in his mind, particularly the moment Amara had spoken up. Her words had been simple, but their impact had been profound, not just on the judge, but on James himself. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Days turned into weeks as James attended the mandated community program. The sessions were held in a modest community center on the edge of town, a building that had seen better days but still served as a hub for those in need. The program coordinator, a woman named Mrs. Franklin, was a no-nonsense yet compassionate figure who seemed to genuinely care about the people she worked with. "Mr. Carter," she said during their first meeting, her sharp eyes studying him over the rim of her glasses. "You're here because the judge believes you have potential. Don't waste it." James nodded, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people believing in him, not employers, not strangers, and certainly not figures of authority. But Mrs. Franklin's words stayed with him, pushing him to engage with the program fully. The sessions covered everything from financial literacy to navigating systemic barriers, and though the information was overwhelming at times, James soaked it up like a sponge. He began to see paths forward he hadn't considered before. Programs for veterans, scholarships for Amara, even legal aid for those facing discrimination. Meanwhile, Amara thrived in her own way. The community center offered a childcare program where she made friends and showcased her drawings proudly to anyone who would look. Her happiness was infectious, and James found himself smiling more often, even as the challenges ahead remained daunting. It was during one of these sessions that James received a surprising invitation. Judge Hayes wanted to meet with him. The message came through Mrs. Franklin, who handed him a neatly folded note with the judge's signature at the bottom. "What does he want?" James asked, his brow furrowing as he stared at the paper. Mrs. Franklin shrugged, though her expression was thoughtful. "Maybe he sees something in you," she said, "something worth nurturing." The meeting was scheduled for the following week in the judge's chambers. James arrived early, his nerves jangling as he stood outside the heavy wooden door. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would the judge reprimand him for some perceived misstep? Offer further resources? Or was this just another test, another hoop to jump through? When he was finally called in, Judge Hayes was seated behind a large oak desk, stacks of papers neatly organized around him. The room was lined with bookshelves, each crammed with legal volumes that seemed to exude authority. Yet, the man behind the desk looked less imposing than James remembered. His expression was thoughtful, his gaze less piercing. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, gesturing for him to sit, "thank you for coming." James nodded, taking the offered seat. He sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I wanted to speak with you," Judge Hayes continued, "because your case, it stayed with me, more than most." James blinked, surprised by the admission. "I don't understand, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled as he considered his words. "Let me tell you a story," he said finally, "about a man who thought he had everything figured out." James listened intently as Judge Hayes recounted his own past. A young, ambitious lawyer with dreams of making a difference, of upholding justice in an imperfect world. But life had a way of humbling even the most determined. The judge spoke of his wife, a woman whose laughter had filled their home and whose love had been his anchor. Her sudden death had shattered him, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief and anger. "I buried myself in my work," the judge admitted, his voice quieter now. "I told myself that the law was my new purpose, that upholding it without compromise was the only way to honor her memory. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the people behind the cases." James shifted in his seat, unsure of what to say. He hadn't expected this glimpse into the judge's life, this vulnerability that seemed so at odds with the stern figure he had seen in court. "Your daughter," the judge said after a moment, "reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That the law isn't just about rules and punishments, it's about people, families, second chances." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. James felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced himself to speak. "Thank you, Your Honor, for seeing us as more than just another case." Judge Hayes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You have a long road ahead, Mr. Carter, but I believe you have the strength to walk it. And if you ever need guidance, you know where to find me." As James left the judge's chambers, he felt a strange mixture of emotions: gratitude, hope, and a lingering sense of awe. The man who had seemed so impenetrable was, in the end, just as human as the rest of them. And in that humanity, James found a renewed determination to keep moving forward. The next time he saw Amara, she was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. She looked up as he walked in, her face lighting up with a smile. "Did the superhero win again?" she asked, her tone teasing. James chuckled, ruffling her hair. "We're getting there, kiddo," he said, "one step at a time." And as he sat beside her, watching her draw a world filled with hope and color, he realized that those steps, no matter how small, were leading them toward a better future. The days following James's meeting with Judge Hayes passed in a whirlwind of reflection and cautious optimism. The judge's words echoed in his mind, their weight growing heavier with each replay. Hayes had extended a bridge, a connection James hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure he deserved. But what struck him most was the judge's admission of vulnerability, his willingness to acknowledge that even those in power were shaped by their losses and regrets. James carried this new understanding with him as he navigated the challenges of daily life. The community program continued to provide valuable insights, offering tools and resources that began to chip away at the walls he had felt trapped behind for so long. Though the changes were incremental, they were changes nonetheless. Steps toward a life that felt less suffocating, more hopeful. Amara, as always, was his anchor. Her laughter filled their small home. Her drawings covered the walls, and her boundless curiosity kept him grounded. But even as she thrived in her world of colors and imagination, James couldn't ignore the realities they faced. The financial strain was ever present, and the scars of systemic injustice lingered, a reminder of the uphill battle ahead. It was during one of the program's evening workshops that James's resolve was tested in an unexpected way. The session focused on conflict resolution, with participants sharing personal stories of hardship and the ways they had navigated moments of intense pressure. As James listened, his mind drifted to his own experiences, the indignities he had endured, the nights spent questioning his worth, the constant push to keep going for Amara's sake. When it was his turn to speak, James hesitated. The room was filled with faces he barely knew, each carrying their own burdens, their own battles. Yet, as he glanced at Mrs. Franklin, who offered him an encouraging nod, he felt a surge of determination. "I don't know if I have much to offer," he began, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "But I've learned that sometimes the hardest thing isn't facing the world, it's facing yourself." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For a long time, I blamed everything around me for the way things turned out. And don't get me wrong, the system is broken and it needs to change. But I realized that if I didn't start fighting for myself and my daughter, no one else was going to do it for me." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the group. James took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. "I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. But we can't let the world define who we are. We have to keep pushing, even when it feels impossible." As he sat down, a ripple of quiet applause filled the room. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of belonging, a connection to others who understood his struggle. The sense of solidarity carried him through the following weeks, bolstering his confidence as he tackled the challenges ahead. But the true test came one evening as he returned home from work. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, when he noticed a small group of people gathered near his driveway. Among them was a man he recognized, a local resident known for his outspoken criticism of families like James's. "What's going on here?" James asked, his voice calm but firm as he approached the group. The man stepped forward, his expression hard and unyielding. "We've had enough of you parking your car on the street like it belongs here," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "This neighborhood has rules, and it's about time someone enforced them." James felt a familiar surge of frustration, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I'm not breaking any rules," he replied evenly, "and I have every right to be here." The man scoffed, crossing his arms. "People like you think you can just do whatever you want. But this isn't your world, Carter. It never was." The words stung, but James refused to let them break him. He straightened his shoulders, his gaze steady. "This is my home," he said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." The tension in the air was palpable, the group shifting uncomfortably as they watched the exchange. For a moment, it seemed as though the man might escalate the confrontation, but then a voice broke through the silence. "Leave him alone." James turned to see Mrs. Holloway standing on her porch, her expression stern. "James is a good man," she continued, her voice carrying across the yard. "And if you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The man faltered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her words. He muttered something under his breath before turning on his heel and walking away, the group dispersing in his wake. James exhaled, relief washing over him as he turned to Mrs. Holloway. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. She smiled, waving him off. "You don't owe me anything, James. Just keep doing what you're doing. You're making a difference, whether you realize it or not." That night, as James tucked Amara into bed, he reflected on the encounter. It had been a reminder of the prejudice that still lingered, but also of the strength he had gained, and the allies he had found along the way. The next day, he returned to the community center with a renewed sense of purpose. During a break between sessions, he approached Mrs. Franklin with an idea that had been forming in his mind. "I want to start something," he said, his words coming out in a rush, "a group or a program, something that helps people like me navigate the system and find their voice." Mrs. Franklin studied him for a moment, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I think that's a wonderful idea, James," she said, "and I'd be happy to help you get started." Over the weeks that followed, James poured his energy into the project, recruiting participants and gathering resources. The group, which he named Voices for Change, quickly gained traction, drawing people from all walks of life who shared a common goal: to create a better future for themselves and their families. Through it all, Amara remained his greatest source of inspiration. Her drawings adorned the walls of the community center, a testament to the hope and resilience that fueled their journey. As the group grew, so did James's sense of purpose. He began to see himself not just as a survivor, but as a leader, someone who could effect real change. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. For the first time in years, James felt a glimmer of something he had almost forgotten: hope. And with it came the determination to keep fighting, not just for himself and Amara, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced, forgotten, or left behind. The first meeting of Voices for Change was a quiet affair. James stood at the front of the community center's modest hall, his palms damp as he adjusted the stack of handouts on the table before him. The turnout was modest, fewer than a dozen people, but each face in the room carried a story, a weight of its own. Some were single parents, others were veterans like him, and a few were older residents looking for ways to support their neighbors. Each had come seeking something: understanding, guidance, a sense of solidarity. Amara sat in the corner of the room, her coloring book open in her lap. Though James had tried to find a sitter for the evening, she had insisted on coming along. "I want to help," she'd said, her eyes bright with determination. Now she was absorbed in her art, her presence a quiet reminder of why James had started this journey in the first place. As the clock struck 6, James cleared his throat, drawing the group's attention. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the fluttering in his chest. "This group isn't about me. It's about us, about finding ways to navigate a system that too often feels like it's working against us. It's about supporting each other and fighting for the change we need." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over the group. Then, slowly, a woman near the back raised her hand. "I don't know if this will work," she said, her tone hesitant, "but I'm here because I'm tired of feeling like I'm alone in this." James nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "You're not alone," he said simply. "None of us are." The meeting began with introductions, each person sharing their story and what had brought them to the group. There were moments of hesitation, of vulnerability, as people spoke of lost jobs, unjust treatment, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. But as the evening went on, something shifted. The room, once filled with wary strangers, began to feel like a community. By the end of the night, James felt a cautious sense of hope. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was a step forward, a spark of connection that could grow into something greater. In the weeks that followed, Voices for Change gained momentum. Word spread throughout the community, and each meeting saw new faces. Local organizations reached out to offer support, providing resources and volunteers to help with workshops on everything from legal rights to job training. The group's mission expanded beyond its original scope, becoming a hub for advocacy and empowerment. James found himself stepping into a role he hadn't anticipated, that of a leader. Though he often felt unqualified, the group's members looked to him for guidance, their trust in him pushing him to rise to the occasion. With the help of Mrs. Franklin and others from the community program, he learned how to organize events, navigate bureaucratic systems, and even speak at public forums. One evening, after a particularly successful meeting, James sat at the kitchen table, poring over notes for an upcoming workshop. Amara sat across from him, her crayons spread out as she worked on another drawing. "What are you working on, kiddo?" James asked, glancing up from his papers. "It's a picture of our group," she replied, holding up the paper. The drawing depicted a diverse crowd of people standing together, their faces turned toward the sun. At the center of the group was a figure holding a sign that read, "We are stronger together." James felt a lump rise in his throat as he studied the drawing. "That's beautiful, Amara," he said softly. "You're a real artist, just like your mom." Amara beamed, her smile lighting up the room. "She'd be proud of you too," she said. "You're helping people, Daddy." Her words stayed with him as the group continued to grow. Each meeting brought new challenges and triumphs, from helping a single mother fight an unjust eviction to organizing a community cleanup that transformed a neglected park into a vibrant gathering place. The work was exhausting, but it was also deeply fulfilling, giving James a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As the group's profile rose, so did the scrutiny. Not everyone in the community welcomed their efforts, and there were moments of tension and conflict. At one town hall meeting, a vocal opponent accused Voices for Change of being disruptive, claiming they were stirring up trouble and undermining the community's stability. James stood his ground, addressing the crowd with the calm resolve he had cultivated over months of advocacy. "We're not here to cause problems," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "We're here to solve them, to make sure everyone in this community has a chance to thrive. Change isn't always easy, but it's necessary." His words were met with a mixture of applause and murmurs of dissent, but James didn't waver. He had come too far to back down now. One of the most pivotal moments came when a local journalist attended one of their meetings and wrote a feature on the group for the city's newspaper. The article highlighted James's journey, framing him as a symbol of resilience and hope. It brought a surge of attention to Voices for Change, drawing both supporters and critics. With the increased visibility came new opportunities. Donations poured in, allowing the group to expand its programs and reach more people. James was invited to speak at larger events, sharing his story and the group's mission with a wider audience. Each step forward felt like a victory, a testament to the power of collective action. But through it all, James never lost sight of what mattered most: Amara. She remained his guiding light, her unwavering faith in him a constant source of strength. On nights when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, her laughter and love reminded him why he had started this journey. As the first anniversary of Voices for Change approached, the group organized a celebration to mark the milestone. The event was held in the newly revitalized park, with food, music, and activities for families. James stood on the small stage, looking out at the crowd that had gathered, a tapestry of faces, each representing a story of struggle and triumph. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. "This group started as an idea, a hope that we could come together to make a difference. But it's become so much more than that. It's a family. And I'm so grateful to be a part of it." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy filling the park with a sense of joy and possibility. As James stepped down from the stage, Amara ran up to him, her arms outstretched. "You did it, Daddy," she said, her voice filled with pride. "We did it," James replied, scooping her up in a hug. That night, as the celebration wound down and the stars filled the sky, James felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would still be challenging, but he no longer faced it alone. Together with Amara and the community they had built, he knew they could face whatever came next. And, for the first time in a long time, James believed in a future filled with hope and change, not just for himself, but for everyone who dared to dream of a better world. Subscribe to stay connected and explore more inspiring stories. Don't forget to share this video with friends who might enjoy it, and check out our channel for more. Let's keep the conversation going.